You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Sherman Soule, here to talk to us about the Route 29 stalker and potential connections with the Long Island serial killing suspect, Rex Heuermann. Sarah, thank you for joining us again on the pod.
Thank you both so much for having me. I am such a fan.
We were trying to figure out when it was that you were on here last. Did we ever figure it out?
I think it was not this past August, but the August before that.
Just remind our listeners, what were we discussing the last time that you joined us?
I actually came on. The first episode was a discussion about the disappearance of a woman here in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I'm from, by the name of Sage Smith. And I wanted to mention that she actually went missing 11 years ago yesterday. I would just like to say that, come on, Charlottesville, solve this murder, because I really don't believe they're working their hardest on this.
I would have to agree. It's a missing persons case, but I don't think Sage is going to walk through the door tomorrow, I think.
Right.
I
We
think
discussed that last time. Yeah, I don't think any of us do.
It's good that you mentioned that. We appreciate being able to mark anniversaries that way.
And then I did the second episode with you all on a woman from Lynchburg who was murdered on the campus of Liberty University, where a convicted serial murderer and rapist went to university. Jesse Matthew is his name. We discussed her on that second episode, and we discussed the phenomenon that is missing white woman syndrome.
Because
we did,
both
indeed.
of these victims are persons of color, and
Yes.
in both examples, they did not seem to get the kind of attention that other cases did right around the same time.
Right.
We're not criticizing any family member or member of the community, for that matter, who had a concern about a missing person or a murder case. It's very striking how much of a difference there was in terms of media coverage in particular.
Really just so sad. Still, I go back now and I look at stuff about Cassandra and stuff about Sage every year, at least every year. And it's just the difference in press coverage, the difference in search efforts between, dare I say, these white, petite, gorgeous young women compared to these black females. Sage was transgender as well, so that's another strike against her as far as law enforcement and looking for her. They both, Cassandra was doing some sex work and she was a drug user, and I was just so struck by the difference in coverage.
And none of us are criticizing Morgan Harrington's family or Hannah Graham's family or anyone for seeking as much coverage as they received, because they obviously had situations where their daughters had gone missing and they needed the media attention as well. It's just very hard not to contrast, particularly since these cases were happening around the same time and in the same area, how much publicity Morgan and Hannah received.
Comparatively, it was on CNN. It was everywhere. Massive searches of Hannah Graham was the largest search in the history of the Commonwealth. When we discussed last time, like, what strikes me so deeply and hits so hard is when Sage Smith's father is commenting on the search for Hannah Graham and when the helicopters flew by his house. And he's just thinking the whole time, like, why didn't they do this for my kid?
Right.
That was a great discussion. And thank you for having me back.
We wanted to spend some time today because we knew that when a certain set of newspaper articles crossed our mutual desks, we figured probably you would be in the best position to talk about it. Just for some context for our listeners who may not be aware, there have been some articles that have appeared in the media recently stating that Long Island serial killer suspect Rex Heuermann appears very similar to the suspect sketch of the Route 29 stalker. As soon as we saw that, I said, oh, I bet Sarah has a lot to say about this. Sarah, for anybody who may not remember the Route 29 stalker, can you give just a really brief rundown of what that case is so that we can jog everybody's memory before we get into the Rex Heuermann of it all?
The Route 29 stalker case begins, it's pretty self-explanatory, on Route 29. Kristin, you described it really well in you all's episodes about the Route 29 stalker. It goes from Maryland to Florida. It's 1,000 miles. It bisects Virginia, if I can borrow your words. And it's a really long road. And it starts out with the case of Alicia Showalter Reynolds. She's a pharmacology student. She's 25 years old and she attends Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. She's traveling south to meet her mother in my town of Charlottesville at a coffee shop off 29 called Greenberries. And they're going to grab a bite and some coffee, and then they're going to go, dress shopping. March 2nd, 1996, Alicia's supposed to show up at 10:30 and she doesn't. And so her mother calls Alicia's husband, Mark, at 11:30. So she gives it an hour. Mark doesn't know, and they don't know where Alicia is. And Alicia's body was found on May 7th of 1996. So it was quite a while. It was a couple months. I'm not quite sure why they haven't released a cause of death. I've heard that she was fairly decomposed. They haven't really released a lot in the stalker case. So I'm also wondering if that might be because they want the killer to say.
A holdback?
Yes, a holdback.
A holdback. Okay, yeah, I gotcha.
Thank you. Okay, so then we have, which you both know very well, Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. They are found dead at a campsite in Shenandoah National Park in May of 1996. So 1996 was a really bad year for us. They were a lesbian couple who were camping and just having a great time out in the Shenandoah National Park, and they were found with their throats slit and naked and bound. Then we have Anne Carolyn McDaniel, who is 20 years old. Now, she was last seen leaving a group home in Orange, Virginia, which is also right off 29, and that was on September 18th of 1996. They found her 4 days later, 10 miles away from where they found Alicia Showalter Reynolds. They found poor Anne burned. Her remains were burned. She had died of asphyxia, but was burned after. We also have a lot of people that they mention when you look at the Route 29 stalker. But from our episode that I came on and did, we have decided, and people have been convicted for certain cases that are still on the list of the Route 29 stalker. Samantha Clark, we're pretty sure that a man named Randy Allen Taylor is good for that.
I think that's pretty solid at this point.
It really is, because he was the last person to call her cell phone. She's in Orange. Is she really going to run into another monster just out leaving her house? That's Randy Taylor.
I think given the high level of communication that Taylor had in the days before she disappeared, particularly on the last day of her life, as far as we can tell, I think Randy Taylor is definitely Samantha Clark's killer. Ironically, he does not seem to have ever been forthcoming with information about where Samantha's remains can be found. Hope still exists that somehow we'll find a way to offer Randy Taylor something. That he wants.
And Bill, isn't it interesting how that same day they found Randy Taylor led them to Alexis's remains, that Samantha Clark's case was reclassified from missing and endangered to homicide?
I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that some limited amount of information must have been offered. Obviously, law enforcement and the people responsible for overseeing Randy Taylor's incarceration would very much like to see additional information. I talked to Alexis's aunt about this several years ago. Trina and I were discussing this off the air about what, if anything, you could offer someone like Randy Taylor in exchange for information like the information he provided regarding where Alexis could be found. Kristin and I had talked about this. Sometimes serial offenders like this will focus on areas where they have a high comfort level.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
We couldn't help but think that there was a possibility that Samantha Clark's remains might be proximate to where Alexis was found.
That's very interesting.
But Kristin was also explaining to me, I'd never been to Orange, Virginia, just how beautiful and rural it is.
Yeah, it is.
It's gorgeous. Oh, yes. And it's vast. And I told you guys last time they drained lakes by my mother's house looking for her. They've done a good job here. They've tried really hard by Samantha. We've really tried looking for her. We've literally drained bodies of water.
So I think Samantha Clark is clearly linked with Randy Taylor, which probably takes her off the Route 29 stalker case, unless you're going to try to build a scenario that positions Randy Taylor as the Route 29 stalker, but I don't think that's the case.
I don't think that's the case either. We'll get into it later, but it takes a special kind of someone to be able to pull over 20 women. That kind of leads into Alexis Murphy, who disappeared on August 3rd of 2013. She was headed from her home in Shipman, Virginia, and she was going to Lynchburg. She was caught on CCTV in Lovingston at this Liberty gas station. And Randy Allen Taylor was there, who would later be convicted for her murder. I still don't know how he got her to go with him. Trina doesn't believe it was about marijuana.
Trina may be right. She's not trying to position Alexis as some sort of saint. Trina may be saying is that Alexis, if she was going to buy marijuana, she would buy marijuana from someone she trusted.
Somebody else.
And this creepy older guy that she ran into at the gas station might not fit that kind of scenario. If you're going to do something that's a little bit risky, I don't think buying pot is a super risky behavior.
You guys, I've met dudes at gas stations and gone to get weed from them. I shouldn't have done it. I regret it. I'm glad I'm alive, but it happens. I agree with what you're saying, Bill. She had a lot of options. She could have gotten that from anybody and not some creepy old Randy Taylor.
Didn't have to be a creeper like Randy Taylor. Agreed, though, we all struggle with this, and we won't ever know unless Taylor tells us why Alexis went with him that day. It's always troubled me. I don't think we have answers there.
We're not going to know. And it's so interesting that he led them there. He led the cops there. He says, yeah, come to my house. And the guy is so stupid. There's a bloody t-shirt and her eyelash extensions and fingernails. And he's so dumb. I have this on good authority from several people who know him that I know. Like, guy's just dumb as a post. There's not much going on upstairs.
In addition to all the things you described inside the trailer, then we have a search outside the trailer. And if I'm not mistaken, her smashed phone is found
15 feet away.
And when you see the photographs of the trailer, it's just horrific. It's definitely...
It's awful.
Into the hoarder kind of category. It's a very strange, bizarrely disorganized way to live. I can't evaluate him from a distance, but I don't think the guy was a rocket scientist.
No, he's not. It's a shame. Also, I should mention Sage Smith. She was a transgender female, 19 years old, last seen in Charlottesville on November 20th of 2012, waiting for a date near downtown, which again is not far from 29. Nothing is far here from 29. We are pretty sure that the person who is responsible for the disappearance of Sage Smith is named Eric McFadden, and he happens to be in the wind right now. He's a fugitive from justice, and the cops need to find him and bring him down here and talk to him.
Oh, absolutely agreed on that one, 100%.
Yeah, and I'd be willing to bet a fancy dinner that McFadden is good for Sage Smith without question. I think McFadden was involved in a relationship with a woman whose name we'll leave out of this thing because she's a victim as much as anyone, in addition to also being involved with Sage. And so there's a romantic triangle going on there.
Which is always high risk.
Yes.
Yeah, and I don't think McFadden was being honest with the other woman he was having a relationship with. So I think McFadden is all over the Sage Smith disappearance without question.
I definitely do too. And that brings us to Cassandra Morton going missing 10 days before a woman called Morgan Harrington goes missing. Cassandra Morton goes missing on November 10th. 2009 from her home on Park Avenue in Lynchburg, which I did go to and scoped out. I went to the site where they found the body. I went to her parents' house. We still don't know what happened to Cassandra, but I think Jesse Matthew is probably good for Cassandra Morton.
I'm a little less certain. Kristin, how do you feel?
Some of them we already have suspects in custody for. Jesse Matthew, like you mentioned, Randy Taylor, like we also mentioned. But then you also have people like Cassandra Morton that maybe you can loop them in as being somebody who's responsible. But at the same time, you also have to look at some of these things and go, okay, maybe not.
Sure.
The most complex areas of this case for me is all of the potential areas of overlap. And we're never really going to know, I think, for Cassandra, was this as a result of some of the sex work that she was doing, or was she a victim of Jesse Matthew? That's, I feel like, where the interesting complexities of the Route 29 stalker case come in for me. We're just never quite sure.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting and it's frustrating, that's for sure. I should say that Cassandra Morton was found 5 weeks after she went missing. So again, with Cassandra, we've got no cause of death. And then Morgan Dana Harrington attends a concert here at the John Paul Jones Arena. She's going to attend a Metallica show, and that's on October 17th of 2009. And she's abducted by now convicted serial killer and rapist Jesse Matthew. Her body, however, is not found till January 26th of 2010, which is, I believe, 105 days, if I'm mathing correctly. Interestingly enough, we had 2 blizzards while she was laying there. Mm-hmm. And so her mother said even her bones were beautiful. I'll never forget that. Morbid, but I don't know. It just harkens such a striking image, a horrific image. It was September of 2013.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Hannah Graham is a UVA student, and the University of Virginia is located in Charlottesville. And she was trying to find a party this one night. She got lost, and she also had been pre-gaming, meaning like drinking. Mm-hmm. She found herself on the downtown mall, which is an outside shopping area. Kristin, I took you down there and I showed you where they got her on the CCTV and everything. And a man called Jesse Matthew, who would be later convicted for this, stalked her all down the downtown mall and buddied up with her in, I think, trying to be in the guise of some kind of savior. She didn't much want anything to do with it. She really tried to push him off and lose him several times that evening, and he just kept popping back up. It was like she stood no chance. And he was supplying her with drinks towards the end of the evening at a bar called Tempo, which is no longer in existence, obviously, because they got in a lot of trouble after that. They end up at his car, and there's witnesses even. I know you know this, but there's witnesses going, he's gonna F her up. All these things. And the police station's like right up the road. I struggle with this because if I saw Jesse and Hannah that night, I often wonder, could I have helped her? I would have asked, can I call someone for you? People saw this, and they saw it all night, and they remarked on it. The dogs found Hannah. They smelled. This was the first case in history, I believe, where the canines actually smelled Hannah's fear. The dogs actually caught her scent on his car, and it was fear.
One of the things that came out during the investigation is that Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham were Jesse Matthews' type. And when they asked people at the bar who knew Matthew, he hung out there frequently, he was known to look for pretty blonde, incapacitated young college women. And these 2 women and many others apparently fit the same pattern where he would find these women. He was working part-time as a cab driver. And of course, that afforded him the opportunity to sexually assault a number of women. He could be involved in other sexual assaults and murders. Certainly, he was linked initially to a case in Fairfax where he had sexually assaulted a woman. But you can see a pattern and a pattern of escalation with Matthew over a period of years.
And that night, the night that he abducted and killed Hannah, that night, you guys, he was just, I think Jim Clemente would call it unraveling, because he's like picking women up at the bar. He's like spinning them around. He took a woman's shoes off, and he said that a woman who takes care of her feet takes care of everything else. This guy's just, he's going to kill someone that night. He is just losing it. And Bill, you brought up a good point. However, I don't think Jesse, and I interviewed my friend who owns a bar called Rapture downtown, and she told me, Sarah, he always hits on the drunkest girl at the bar. She would warn them, don't go home with this guy. She knew. She didn't know he was a murderer, but she got a really bad vibe off him. And anybody, I think if you're a bartender, if you're an establishment owner and you notice this creep or person like hitting on the most disadvantaged girl at the bar, you're going to keep that in your mind and store that for later. So he did have quite a reputation.
Although part of me wants to say that's the kind of guy that should be banned from your bar. It's just
it probably should be.
People that are known to slip drugs surreptitiously into women's drinks, which has been just endemic in the past several years. These are things that bartenders and waitresses and the owners of bars need to be watching for. There were people interviewed after the Jesse Matthew case began to come together that said his reputation preceded him for years. Wow. And he was known as a creeper, and he was known as a rapist, and this was permitted to go on. He always, like you said, hit on the drunkest woman at the bar because he knew that he could take them home or take them out to his car and sexually assault them, and many of them would never report it. So I think he's responsible for any number of other unsolved and perhaps unreported sexual assaults. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
I think it's very interesting, Sarah. We've talked about a number of cases here that are Route 29 stalker adjacent. We've mentioned Jesse Matthew, who is a known serial killer. We have mentioned Randy Taylor, who also is good for, we're fairly sure, 2 murders. Yes. Samantha Clark and Alexis Murphy. But now this idea that has come up recently in the press that maybe he's only been accused, not convicted, but another accused serial killer, Rex Heuermann, was apparently maybe spending some time in Virginia right around the same time of the Route 29 stalker case. So this article crossed our desks, Bill and mine, I think about a week ago, maybe.
About a week.
It took me a little bit to be able to catch up on it, but then people started sending me copies and copies, and they were like, have you followed this? The conceit here, I think, is that the Route 29 stalker suspect sketch looks very similar to Rex Heuermann, who is the accused Long Island serial killer, the Lisk killer.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that, Sarah? When you saw that suspect sketch and you saw that picture of Rex Heuermann, did bells go off for you? Was it like a ding ding moment, or what are your thoughts on this?
It was a little bit of both, a ding ding moment and then a not so much moment. But he does look like the sketch with that wispy reddish brown hair. And I've been told, I can't find a picture of him from 96. I haven't been able to yet, but I've been told by several sources that he wasn't as big then. He's tall, but he wasn't apparently as round then.
I've seen some photographs of him, and he was definitely thinner, and his face was thinner.
Face is thinner?
He's still round-faced, but not as beefy-looking as he is now. I think his correct height is 6'4".
But yeah, big guy. My initial thoughts were, wow, this is interesting, right? Of course, because he does look like the sketch. And I talked a little bit off air about Heuermann and his profile. It has been rumored to be able to convince sex workers who have been at this a while to do certain things that sex workers wouldn't normally do, as in leave their cell phones. What always bothered me about the Alicia Showalter Reynolds case is that I know she's 25. She's a graduate student at Hopkins. Like, this is a smart person. Who is going to convince her that her car is having sparks and your car is having trouble and pull her over and get her into a car. What man? And then I thought about the psychopathy of Rex Heuermann, and he does line up with that. I think he could probably talk Alicia Reynolds into a car. So that was interesting to me. However, I have to say that you guys both know I'm not formally trained. I'm not Quantico, but I've certainly schooled myself from the very best for years. And Rex Heuermann is doing one type of thing in Long Island since probably 1996, and that is trolling girls, trolling escorts, trolling sex workers, whether that be on the street, in sex clubs. It's most of the time he's doing it on Craigslist, or what was called Backpage. He is trolling for, his preference is sex workers who look very childlike. He is very driven to find this specific victim for this specific time and for this specific purpose. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And so I think that it's a bit of a stretch to think that Rex Heuermann has suddenly decided to pull over random women and start telling them that there's something wrong with their car in hopes of killing them. It's just not his MO. And I realize that serial killers switch MOs.
Mm-hmm.
I realize that happens. I just don't think it statistically happens in this way. I would like to mention that, of course, it's very strange that Heuermann's mother was living 15 miles away from me in a town called Palmyra, Virginia.
Oh, Palmyra, yeah.
In a development called Lake Monticello, which has always, it's so funny, that development has always reminded me so much of that place Shannon Gilbert from the Long Island serial killer case went missing from, called Oak Beach. It just has this kind of similar vibe, especially at night. And I also found out a really interesting thing, and I'm allowed to say it because I talked to a lawyer friend of mine a couple of days ago.
Okay.
And she told me I'm totally cool to say it. Lake Monticello, where Heuermann's mother was living, has a thriving swingers club.
Oh, my.
And it's interesting with this swingers club down here. And then there's been talk of Rex and his wife attending a swingers club the night that they met Karen Vergata, who was formerly known as Fire Island Jane Doe. So you have these little interesting kernels around this Alicia Showalter Reynolds case and Rex Heuermann. Like for example, I mapped out his route. The route that, say, he would have taken if he was going to visit his mother that day from Massapequa Park to Palmyra, Virginia. And he's on her route. If he's on 95 and she's going from Baltimore to Charlottesville, she's on 95, then she's on 29. I always thought that that someone caught her in their sights closer to Culpeper. And then with this Heuermann development, or this Heuermann maybe possible tie-in, it makes me wonder, that's interesting, like if it was Heuermann, did he get her in his sights much more closer to Maryland if it was him? And did he stalk her? Because he certainly was a stalker. He loves to troll. He stalks the victims' families. He calls them. He's a sexual sadist. So he likes to, even after his victims are dead, he likes to prolong the torture and inflict it upon the families and friends. He's quite a piece of work. I find it all really interesting. However, I do find it a reach, just given who Rex Heuermann is compared to who I think the Route 29 stalker is, as far as their profiles.
That sounds like a pretty good assessment to me. And I know that when a bunch of people reached out and said, hey, have you read this? What do you think? My first impulse was to say, oh, this is interesting. And certainly the sketch has some similarities to Heuermann. But my first impulse was to go, okay, are we trying to link what we think is the serial killer of the moment? Are we trying to link Rex Heuermann to everything up and down the East Coast that's unsolved? Because it does feel like sometimes that happens. We've heard in our case, Zodiac did Colonial Parkway Murders. Edward Edwards did it. Like insert serial killer of the week.
Sure.
Someone has tried to connect them. So I will admit that my first thought when people started sending this to me, it was multiple people, My first thought was, this is interesting, but is it only because Rex Heuermann was so recently in the news that it's happening, or is this a legitimate piece of intelligence?
Bill and Kristin, I do want to mention that Rex has property in South Carolina, and they are looking at a girl that I truly believe could be a victim of his down there named Julia Bean. The story, it just adds up. And then there's texts after she disappears that I don't think are from Julia. It's quite interesting. So we do have him traveling down the coast, which is, I found interesting. And of course, they do this every time with the serial killer of the week. When someone gets arrested, they want to look into him for other things.
Yeah.
I personally think that this should be investigated thoroughly.
Agreed. And one interesting development from my perspective as well is that Alicia Showalter Reynolds' siblings have now stepped forward. And as we were discussing off air, this is for the first time that I'm aware of. Patrick Showalter, who's actually Alicia's twin brother, and her younger sister, Barbara Showalter Josephans, if I'm saying that correctly, have both spoken out and done interviews in the media saying that they think similarities are substantial enough that they believe the Virginia State Police should be coordinating with New York authorities and, of course, the FBI to at least take a look at Heuermann as a potential suspect in the Route 29 stalker case.
And Bill, I believe that they are, because I had a conversation last night with John Ray, who is Shannon Gilbert's family's attorney up in Long Island, and he represents some of the other victims' family members as well. I was calling him because I really wanted to know what kind of vehicle Heuermann was driving back in '96, and I couldn't for the life of me find it. A friend of mine said, why don't you just call up that guy, John Ray, and see if he can help you out? So I did, and he called me back, and they are trying to find that vehicle now. They have not been able to find it either, but he told me some interesting stuff that we know that Rex Heuermann bought 2 Chevy Avalanches in a row. Those are pickup trucks, the vehicle he had when he was arrested. He purchased the first one in 2001 when the Chevy Avalanche came out. So those were not released before 2001. So he wouldn't have been driving that in 1996. The point that John Ray made to me was that he did favor pickup trucks. So this goes back. I think that's also a little interesting, seeing as our POI for the 29 Stalker, everybody says it's a dark Ford or Mazda pickup truck or a pickup truck with zigzags. We know that Rex likes trucks. I guess that's you could check that. I was disappointed in that I didn't get to find out the exact make and model of the vehicle he was driving in '96, although Mr. Ray said that Rex had access to several vehicles throughout the years.
Interesting as well that in the Route 29 stalker case, they also felt that the offender had access to multiple vehicles because there were several different pickup trucks described as being used by this potential offender. It's also interesting that close to 20 women came forward after Alicia Showalter Reynolds disappeared and was found murdered. And they had said that someone attempted to pull them over. And my recollection is that at least 3 to 5 of them actually did pull over. So he was able to convince some of these women. And remember, some of this is during the day as well. He's not necessarily doing this at night where I think people's antenna would be even further up in terms of potential problems along the road. This Route 29 stalker suspect did manage to convince a fair number of people to pull over. Some of them interacted with him at gas stations. At least one victim climbed into his pickup truck with him after getting this same line about, oh, there were sparks under your car.
Right.
You need to pull over. I'll take you to a safe spot. And she actually managed to escape his truck after he attempted to stab her with a screwdriver. She jumped out of a moving vehicle, broke her ankle, is my recollection.
She broke her ankle.
She did survive, and she's actually one of the people who provided the description, which resulted in the sketch. It is true. I don't think there's much way around this. From my point of view, Rex Heuermann does look a fair amount like the sketch.
He really does. I just have the problem with, is he really going to switch his whole mind up and decide to go after women who are not sex workers, women who are lone travelers on the road? And he's going to start with this thing of, hey, there's sparks flying from your car. We need to find you a mechanic. It doesn't really add up for me. And it doesn't mean that he's not the guy. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying that with all the work and research that I've put into this list case, with everything I know about criminals, which pales in comparison to some folks y'all know, I'm just saying that the victimology, it's completely different. That part of it, which is so important, it's just not there for me.
I share your skepticism. The one thing I'll say, a thought that has crossed my mind while we've been talking about this, is there any chance that Heuermann is keeping himself entertained?
I've thought about that.
With the long drive to Virginia to see his mother, who does live in the area. He is thinking to himself, I'm just going to try this out. Because even the Virginia State Police said at the time, they thought that the offender was escalating. He was trying to get up the nerve to attack these women. This could have been a game for the offender as well, a cat and mouse thing. Can I convince complete strangers, these women in these other cars, to pull over based on there's a problem with your vehicle, beeping his horn and flashing his lights and pointing under their vehicles? And it did actually work.
Could this be serial killer cat and mouse games?
Right. And Bill and Kristin, I also thought of, 1996 is up in Long Island. That's when Karen Vergata goes missing, who was formerly known as Fire Island Jane Doe. Mm-hmm. And she is associated with Rex Heuermann. He has not been charged for her. He's been only charged with 3 of the Gilgo Beach 4. Karen Vergata is in 96. I'm thinking that's the first victim that we know of that we can associate with Heuermann, or possibly associate with Heuermann. I was thinking on the other side of this, like you, Bill, this is a serial killer who is just forming. So maybe he is going down to Virginia and he is saying, hey, how about I try this? This is exciting. Maybe I can do this. Maybe I can get these women in my car with me. Maybe I can do this whole different thing. Picture kind of a baby serial killer. Maybe he's doing his thing up in Long Island with the sex workers, and then he's in Virginia down here stalking and pulling women over. There's a possibility.
And there's one other thing I'll throw in the mix here. If this was Heuermann, if he was not as well plugged into access to sex workers in Virginia as he would have been in his home turf of Long Island. When we talked to our friend Joe Giacalone, longtime cold case homicide detective, he felt that the Gilgo Beach 4 Long Island serial killer offender, now identified as Rex Heuermann, had switched up his approach from initially picking up prostitutes off the streets of primarily New York City and that area. Then he transitioned over to using the newspaper, newsletter, back pages, and escort service ads on Craigslist, and then ultimately moves more towards an internet model as those businesses shifted their focus. Each of those steps allows someone like Heuermann to distance himself a bit from being tracked in terms of making these connections with these sex workers. He's moving away from picking up what were then called streetwalkers, and then obviously he can be seen negotiating with and connecting with those women and then inviting them into his vehicle. You can see how the change to print and then the internet gives him more distance.
It gives him more anonymity, I think.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And this was something that Joe Giacalone had mentioned to us. He believes that Heuermann took advantage of those technological advancements as a way of creating that distance. He's still making the connection into a paid sex worker encounter, but he's doing it in a way where he's not actually going to be seen because the whole thing ultimately shifts over to the internet.
It does. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating to think that Heuermann could just be doing his thing in Virginia. it wasn't linking up for me until we really started to talk about it.
I think a good question to leave this on, because this is a fascinating conversation, but ultimately it's one that is going to require further investigation from law enforcement as opposed to from the three of us.
Yeah.
But I do think it is very interesting to note why so many serial killers in your particular area of Virginia, Sarah, because there have been so many.
I went back to that with my husband the other night, Kristin. Just how many can there be? And then you guys talking to Fitz about the probability and it's just, it's horrifying.
It is. And I think that is something, whether it turns out Rex Heuermann was hunting here or no, it is definitely something worth pondering.
It really is. And it definitely deserves a thorough investigation.
Listeners, we hope that you will sound off in the comments for this episode. What do you think? Was Rex Heuermann potentially hunting in Virginia as part of the Route 29 Stalker case? We would love to hear your thoughts. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time and expertise.
Thank you both so much. It was my pleasure.
That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.